Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. Thanks for listening. Hope you're already subscribing. If you're not, please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your listening.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
This week, America, Russia, China, and the struggle for global supremacy in the 21st century. Yes, we tackle the big subjects on this podcast. This week, we're going to look at that question of global geopolitical politics, geopolitical power in the current environment. Many people talk about it as being in a new Cold War with China. But there are lots of similarities and differences with the old Cold War, the one that we won, you'll recall, against the Soviet Union and its allies 30 or so years ago. And every day we are confronted with the reality of that, of those differences, of that relationship between the United States and China. Just last month, President Trump and Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, reached a kind of what we can call a truce in their long simmering trade war between the two countries. China agreed not to block exports of vital commodities, the so-called rare earth minerals that we need so much for so much of our economic activity. And President Trump agreed to reduce the tariffs that he'd threatened on Chinese imports. Now, it was a reminder of how important the economic relationship is between the United States and China. So where does it fit into that larger question of how we deal with the rise of China in the 21st century? If we are locked in such a tight embrace with China, economically speaking, can we really handle the geopolitical and strategic challenges that China presents to us? And what does it mean? How do we deal with Russia? Russia, of course, and China are close allies. It's also another difference, really, from what we saw in most of the last Cold War. We have Russia, still the largest nuclear power on earth, with the United States, threatening its neighbors, invading its neighbors, but being very closely allied to China too. How do we handle that relationship? And indeed, more broadly, how do we maintain U.S. supremacy in the world? And what kind of U.S. supremacy can we expect? There's a lot of discussion here right now about the changing nature of American politics and American society, and we're living in we're not continuing to be the liberal democracy and the avatar of liberal democracy that the United States has perhaps seen itself as over the last century or so. We're entering what many people think of as a post-liberal world in which America perhaps is leading the way in becoming a rather different sort of country. So how are all these strands, how is this struggle with China, the relationship between China and Russia, America's role in the world, America that was changing, how is all that going to evolve? And what's the right way forward for the United States, again, to maintain our security, to maintain our global leadership? I'm delighted to say I'm joined this week to discuss this meaty topic by an expert on some of these superpower relations. Michael McFaul is a professor at Stanford University. He served as ambassador to Moscow during the Obama administration. He also worked on the National Security Council during the Obama administration. And he has a fascinating new book out called Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder, in which he addresses the history of these relationships between the United States and Russia and the United States and China, and looks now at the current circumstances we're in and what we can expect and how the United States should handle these relationships going forward. So delighted to be joined by Michael McFaul. Michael, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thanks for having me.
Fascinated by the book. Thank you very much indeed, and congratulations on it. Autocrats versus Democrats. A lot to talk about in there. Want to dig into some of the details, but one of the first things, and you address this sort of right at the start of the book, is we're living, as I said in my introduction, in an age that many people have described as a new Cold War, Cold War II, the second Cold War, however you might want to think about it, but this time between the United States and China primarily, the first one having been between the United States and the Soviet Union and its allies. And there are some similarities and differences, and you talk about that at the start of the book. But again, there are important differences as well as similarities. Tell us how you see the analogy, if you like, of this relationship between the United States and China with with the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union in the last Cold War?
Well, that's a great first question, and it's the question that in part motivated me writing the book. Several years ago, we did arrive at this metaphor and this analogy. It became a bit of a consensus here in the United States, and I wanted to, as a social scientist, look for data to support and confirm that hypothesis or not. And I came out with a pretty complex, nuanced answer that there are, just as you said, yes, there are similarities, but there are also differences. And with respect to foreign policy for the future, we got to get that right. We got to get the diagnostics right if we're going to have an effective prescriptive foreign policy. So similarities, I'll go through them quickly. I won't go through them all, but two global powers ahead of everybody else, check. That's the same. Two superpowers with different regime types, autocracies versus democracies, check. That's just like the Cold War. Three, ideological competition around the world. Yes, I see evidence for that as well. And fourth, my tragic prediction in the book is that this is going to last, this competition, for decades, just like the Cold War did. But on the differences side, I see some other compelling differences that we can't ignore. Some obvious, some not so obvious. So the obvious one is, unlike the Soviet economy and the American economy in the last century, the Chinese and American economy are highly intertwined. And two, even more importantly, the Chinese economy is highly intertwined in the global economy. And those dreaming that we're going to go back to kind of blue blocks and red blocks with regard to trade and investment in people, I just think that's analytically wrong, and we will fail to try to do that. Second, there's a ideological competition between autocrats and Democrats. I have 3 chapters on that, including one on Xi Jinping and what he does to support autocracies around the world. And at the same time, I do not think this ideological competition is as intense or acute or threatening to the United States as the Soviet threat was. A lot of politicians use this phrase existential threat. That means literally a threat to our existence. I looked at the data hard. I looked at both intentions and capabilities, and I don't see that intentions from the Communist Party of China. And even if they had it in some secret room where they're dreaming about, destroying America, they don't have the capabilities to do that. But then a third difference, among many others, is about us. During the Cold War, we most certainly had our differences and debates about foreign policy, Vietnam War being probably the most extreme one. But there was a kind of consensus between Democrats and Republicans that we had to remain engaged in the world, that we had to contain the Soviets in order to defend our national interests. Today, there's a retrenchment movement going on inside the United States. It's deeper in the Republican Party, but it is very present in the Democratic Party as well. That's a big difference. We did not have that kind of isolationist tendencies. I think you got to go back to the 1930s to be reminded of a parallel time. That's not the Cold War.
Thank you. That's an admirable summary. Let's dig into that a little bit, especially the differences with the Cold War. And you say, it's clear the Soviet Union had both direct sort of geopolitical ambitions, which,
Yes.
it met to some extent. It dominated, it literally, essentially controlled most of Eastern Europe. And when famously, countries in Eastern Europe tried in some ways to break away from Soviet domination, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, it slapped them down pretty hard. It tried to sort of export its brand of Soviet Marxism into other countries, into other parts of the world, other countries too, like Afghanistan, and of course, pursuing what it was doing in Latin America, to some extent in Africa. China, so you think China does seem different, obviously, both in terms of its immediate geographic, and we can talk a bit about Taiwan, but that's a very particular challenge, I think. But what does China want then? I mean, it was pretty obvious what we thought it was pretty obvious what the Soviet Union wanted. What do you think China? How do you think China intends to use or desires to use this significant economic and strategic power that it has been building up and continues to build up?
Well, I do think the differences you just took through are very important. Either people forgot about the Cold War, or where I teach at Stanford, my kids never, they're learning about the Cold War for the first time and taking my class. But those things that you just mentioned about Soviet intentions and actions, it wasn't just that they wanted to make the whole world communist. They said that repeatedly in their speeches and in their writings. They actually used resources, devoted resources to it. And Czechoslovakia in 1948, when they took over that country and then invaded Hungary 56, Czechoslovakia, arming, the Vietnamese, arming the Koreans, and then Angola, Mozambique, Nicaragua, Afghanistan. There's just nothing parallel to that in Chinese behavior, at least not yet. The closest thing we have is what Xi Jinping did to squelch freedom in Hong Kong, and that reminds me a bit of that period in Eastern Europe after 1945. But it's different because Hong Kong was never recognized by any other state as an independent state. What I think they try to do, and here I want to emphasize, I know a lot about the Cold War, I know a lot about Russia, I know a lot about American foreign policy. Why this book took me years and years to write was I really had to learn about China. I've been going there since the 80s, but I'm not a China expert. And so I've had to rely on reading others. And thankfully, we have a lot of great China experts in America and the world. But my reading of that literature as a second, reading it as an outsider, not as I don't speak Mandarin, is that I think their intentions are, one, to dominate and expand their power. By the way, that is something all great powers have done for thousands of years. And it's surprising when they don't do that. But their strategy is not to blow up the international system and not to foment revolution inside other countries. I see no evidence, for instance, that the Chinese Communist Party is fomenting revolution inside the United States or the rest of the high income countries in the world. Rather, they have one foot in the old order that we created, and they're using that influence, in those international institutions to advance their interests. And sometimes they break the rules, like in the WTO, to do that, and they should be held accountable. And then second, and this is something I worry a lot about that we're not doing, they're creating a bunch of their own clubs. Just like we did after World War II, they're creating their own clubs, right? Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, AIIB, Belt and Road Initiative, where they're at the center of those multilateral organizations, and the United States and most of the free world are not present. And that worries me. We should be doing the same. And instead, we're pulling out of the old order, and we're not building much new of anything.
Let's talk about Taiwan in particular. You mentioned it at the beginning. By the way, fascinating reading your chapter on Xi Jinping's thought, which informs some of the things that you've just been talking about there about what China's trying to do. But let's talk particularly about Taiwan, because this is always sort of cited as the likely or possible flashpoint between the US. Let me ask a question that maybe a lot of people don't really ask, and it's a sort of maybe almost a naive question. Why on earth should the US really care about whether or not China recovers Taiwan? Taiwan is, it was, I know it's had a long and complex history, but it was the place where the sort of opponents of the Communist Party fled to after the communists took over China. It's a it is a Chinese island. I know it's been occupied by the Japanese and others too in its past, but China has recovered Hong Kong again, breaking all kinds of promises that it made that it did so. But that was a British colony. We live in a post-colonial age where most people think that's gone. Macau was the same with Portuguese. China has recovered, in other words, its so-called century of humiliation. It's just going about restoring all the territory that it had before it was, overthrown by this century of humiliation. Why should we really, realistically commit any sort of US resources, let alone the prospect of going to war with China over China recovering Taiwan?
Well, that's the fundamental question. It's a great question, and I do try to answer it in the book, but it's a hard question. I'm glad you're asking it. In my view, thinking about American national interests, right? I'm not thinking about the interests of Taiwan or other countries. I think there are three reasons why we care. One, Taiwan's a democracy, and I like Democrats better than Autocrats. That's the title of my book. And I think we win in the long run if we support liberal democratic values, freedom and liberty, as opposed to not. And that's one of the lessons from the Cold War. A lot of hypocrisy, and I go through all that hypocrisy. For your listeners, I have a whole book on mistakes in the Cold War, just so you know. But I think that's in America's national interest to support democracies against autocracies. Number two, an invasion of Taiwan would be highly disruptive to the global economy. This notion that it'll be an easy invasion and everything will just fall over and everything will be fine. I was just in Taiwan 3 months ago, and that is not my impression about what would happen with an invasion. And we're talking about, a global economic depression as a result of that war. And then three, as you just alluded to, because of our policy of strategic ambiguity, I worry that an invasion of the island of Taiwan could drag us into that war. And I don't want to go to war with China. I don't think that's in America's national interest. So rather than that, when I teach about American foreign policy here at Stanford, I emphasize in my class non-events. Lots of books have been written about revolutions and wars and electoral victories. We don't have a lot of books about revolutions that almost happened, wars that almost happened, elections that were almost won. And I emphasize that because I think one of the greatest successes of the Cold War was the non-event of a war over the island of Taiwan. And American and British and Chinese and Japanese leaders should get a lot of credit for that. And sometimes non-events have to be the outcome that we seek to achieve. So in my book, I say, let's expand deterrence to make an invasion of the island more costly. And that's things that we can do and the Japanese can do, but mostly the Taiwanese need to do. And I talk about that. And then second, and I know this is going to be unpopular for some, but I say we need to take off the table with clarity the idea that we would recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Because that to me is a trigger to war. And I don't think war is in America's national interest. And so sometimes, when I was in the government, I noticed we Americans, we tend to be like engineers. We want to solve problems and end them and do this. And sometimes that gets us involved in all kinds of things we shouldn't be involved in. And I've learned over the years that sometimes all problems can't be solved. And just leaving ambiguity and leaving the status quo is as much that can be hoped for. And that most certainly is my view when it comes to Taiwan.
If China isn't really the kind of existential threat to us, to our way of life, that, as you say, the Soviet Union clearly was, if what China's trying to do is obviously develop economic growth so that it can get greater prosperity for its citizens, it's still, despite its, as we know, despite its rapid economic growth, it's still a poor country by US standards in terms of GDP per head. If it's trying to recover territories lost over that period, the century of humiliation from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, why do we need to be in conflict with them? Why not go back to that period that various presidents tried, including the president you worked for, but President Bush before him, of strategic cooperation with China, of actually, if we're not really in this sort of existential ideological struggle, why do we have to think about it at all in a kind of confrontational framework?
Well, I do think we are going to compete with them. And, in American history, not always, but great powers that are dictatorships tend to give us trouble. And at times we've gone to war with them. So that, I think, is a kind of just a condition of our great power relationship today. Number two, no matter how much we talk, happy talk, I just spoke to a bunch of Chinese visitors here at Stanford yesterday. Xi Jinping and the Communist Party are going to be threatened by free countries. That's just, they all are. Putin is, Xi Jinping is, because we have a different argument for legitimacy than they do. And so when there are democratic uprisings, whether it's in Hong Kong in 2014 for Xi Jinping, or the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, those are threatening things to autocrats, and that creates tension. I have a deep personal experience with it when I worked in Russia as the ambassador, because I was blamed for fomenting revolution against Putin every single day. But I think you're onto something important. And by the way, people that study the Cold War know this, was that even during the Cold War, we in the 60s and especially in the 70s began to manage our competition with the Soviets more effectively. And on certain issues, we found that we had common interests. So at the height of the Vietnam War, 1968, we get together with the Soviets and sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because we decided collectively that we don't have an interest in nuclear weapons spreading all over the world. We eradicated smallpox during the Cold War. We did arms control. It took a long time until those numbers came down. But those are three things that we're not doing with the Chinese today, right? We're not doing any kind of arms control talk with them. We're not cooperating in these multilateral fora. And another thing we did in the Cold War that I think is a very important lesson for this moment is after 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we almost blew up the world, leaders in both Washington and Moscow said we have to put in some crisis management, crisis prevention mechanisms. Symbolically, that was the red phone, the hotline, right? But that was the symbol. There were all kinds of things that we did. We talked, we shared information about our weapon systems as a way to stabilize things. And when I compare the 60s and 70s in the book and all that interaction we had with our enemies, we don't have nearly as much of that going on with the Chinese today. And I think that even if you think it is a Cold War, we should be reminded that even during the Cold War, we did those kinds of things.
Do you think China wants the US out of what we think of as the Western Pacific, out of East Asia? Essentially, we have this network of alliances, obviously, with Japan and with Korea. We have significant military deployments in the region. Australia is an important there's no question that the United States is an Asian power in that sense.
Yes.
With that network of alliances and with its military capabilities. Do you think that at minimum, even if China doesn't want to kind of, fundamentally change the United States into a sort of Marxist-Leninist country along its lines, do you think it really is a threat to the United States in that sense, in that it just says, US, get the hell out of East Asia?
Yes, without question. And that's where in my book, Taiwan's at the top of my list about where we might go to great power war. Lithuania and Estonia are another place where I worry about great power war happening, even inadvertently. And South China Sea and that region, yes, there's no doubt that Xi Jinping at least wants to see the United States retreat. And I say, so what? So, I want a lot of things I can't get to, Mr. Chairman. And I think, all of those alliances that you just mentioned are defensive alliances. I see no evidence whatsoever that we're planning to attack China, despite what their propaganda says. I write the same thing about NATO in Europe, by the way. NATO's never attacked the Soviet Union and Russia and never will. So that we just got to get used to these things. And I think that alliances actually help to keep the peace in both Europe and Asia. And we've just got to work with the Chinese so that they understand that we are not leaving. Now, I want to also emphasize, not everybody in America agrees with me on that, and that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, was to make the case for why continued engagement is in our security interests, in our interests, economic interests, and to support our values. But if we can get that together, I think the status quo is preferable to us leaving. And, that's a vacuum. I worry that if we retreat, it's not China that's going to take over the world. It'll just be a much more anarchic, chaotic world.
I want to get on to your recommendations and your concerns, your recommendations for the US and your concerns about again what we talked a little bit about earlier about the sort of isolationism or the anti-interventionism and what that should mean for US policy. Let's quickly move on to Russia. You spent a lot of time in Russia. Again, let's say you were ambassador there. You studied Russia a lot. You spent some time in Russia and other parts of your life. Is Russia currently under Vladimir Putin? Is Russia a greater threat to America, to our security, than China?
I think so. I do. And I know that's a controversial statement, but let me explain why I worry about it. Number one, Putin is an ideological leader. I met him in 1991. I've followed his career. I think the word Putin appears on more of my publications than any other word. I dealt with him for 5 years when I was in the government. And obviously I follow what he's doing today, especially this barbaric war that he's launched against Ukraine. And he is way more revisionist than Xi Jinping. He wants to tear it all down. And he's using a variety of techniques to do that. One is propagating illiberal populist nationalism, which he's been investing in for decades now. And I think we were not watching this as closely as we should. So that's Russia Today. That's NGOs that meet with Western, European, and American NGOs along the same ideological space. That's sending the soldiers into places like Georgia and Ukraine, of course. That's another instrument of disruption. And that's the difference from the Cold War too. The Cold War was mostly ideological competition between states. Putin is fomenting this ideological competition within states. And so there are Americans that have more ideologically in common with Vladimir Putin than they have with me, even though we both have the same citizenship. That's different. Yeah, we had communists in the Cold War. We had a few up there in Berkeley, and there were some liberals, obviously, within the Soviet Union, but they were marginal to our society. That's different. I've never been invited to be on InfoWars, for instance, right? They're not interested in talking to me, but they have Sasha Dugin on all the time. He's one of the chief ideologues for Putin. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is Putin does not have nearly the capabilities of either the United States or China. I go through all that data in the book. But what he does have, he's shown to be a risk taker. And the older he gets, the riskier things he's been doing. And that's what worries me about, the full-scale invasion in Europe for the first time since World War II. He already did that. That's a pretty risky endeavor. But the teasing and prodding of our allies, our NATO allies, that just shows a tolerance for risk that I think is very dangerous and could drag us into a war. And so I worry more about Putin, honestly, dragging us into a war than I do Xi Jinping.
We can agree that Putin is an autocrat and a dictator, and has done some absolutely appalling things. But that there is a question about whether or not we miscalculated about Ukraine in particular. That the importance of Ukraine to Russia, particularly, I mean, obviously Russia lost, at the end of the Cold War, as it were, Russia lost the Baltic states, it lost many of the Warsaw Pact countries, wasn't happy about it, but, the sort of people like Yeltsin accepted that. But even for somebody like Yeltsin, or even for Gorbachev before that, the Russian leaders, there is something particularly about Ukraine that is culturally, historically, absolutely essential to the kind of Russian identity, to the Russian identity of itself. I was speaking very recently to a sort of senior Eastern European politician who said, without Ukraine as an ally or essentially a kind of satellite, Russia can't have any claim to any kind of an empire, really, because it's so central to it. Did we miscalculate by moving? And again, I understand it may well have been the will of the Ukrainian people, and we can talk about the various revolutions, the Maidan, and all the other things that happened. But did we miscalculate by essentially encouraging the idea that Ukraine could actually fundamentally separate itself from the Russian orbit, become Western, become a member of the EU, maybe even become a member of NATO? And did we miscalculate in failing to understand the threat that would represent, not just to Vladimir Putin, but actually to the kind of, if you like, to the sort of the core of mainstream Russian foreign policy thinking over the last 30, 40 years?
Well, I think we were actually rather passive in this story. We did barely nothing for the Ukrainians, including the government I served in. I was mostly driven by Ukrainians. And they want to be a free country. And that fundamental tension, I've been in the room with Putin many times. He thinks Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. He says that, just to that point, right? They're part of our nation. The Bolsheviks peeled them off in 1917, and then the CIA did in 1991. I'm going to reunify the Slavic nation. But they just have a different opinion about that. Kind of reminds me of the American Revolution, that we also were said we were just part of the British Empire, and just, some Americans said, we don't want to be part of the British Empire anymore. And that created a war. We went to war over that. And just because you have shared culture and shared language, I grew up in Montana on the Canadian border, right? We watched all the same TV programs. We have the same accents. My accent is more closer to Canadians than yours. And we went to the same churches and watched the same TV shows, in the 70s. that doesn't mean that they have to be part of America. But that was driven by Ukrainians. We in the West, I'll just say the United States. I don't want to speak for European countries. We were reactive the whole time. So Orange Revolution, we just were reacting to that event. 2004. And when I was in the government, 2013, President Yanukovych of Ukraine, he's supposed to go and sign an EU accession agreement that, in our estimation, would have led to Ukraine joining the EU like in 2060 or some absurd thing like that. Ask the Turks about signing these agreements. There was no urgency to that at all. And then he didn't sign it. And I'm telling you honestly, I was sitting in Moscow, I got the cables, and I was like, what's the big deal? Okay, there'll be another summit some other time and we'll sign another agreement. That's the nature of diplomacy. But there was this crazy Ukrainian guy, and I know him. His name is Mustafa Naim, immigrant from Afghanistan, right? His family fled Afghanistan during the Soviet times. And he said, I want to be part of Europe. And then he got on Facebook. So maybe that's our intervention, right? It was an American company, but it wasn't the US government. And he said, if we get to 10,000 likes, we'll all go to Maidan. And they did that because they had this crazy idea that they wanted to be part of Europe. And that's literally what started the revolution of dignity, wanting to be European. My view, and let me say one other thing on this, is very important. Putin and Medvedev and all these guys, I know all these people. I've known them, worked with them, and I've known them for a long time. They're not threatened by NATO expansion. That is just a myth. Because NATO hasn't effectively expanded since 2004. There was no momentum for Ukraine joining NATO in 2022. Absolutely nothing was going on. Nobody in NATO, with the exception of a few countries in Eastern Europe, wanted them to join. What he is, however, threatened by, to your point, Putin's threatened by democratic expansion. And Ukraine does threaten his rule inside Russia. Because he tells his people in his country that we're different than the West. I've heard him say it in a meeting I was in with Vice President Biden in 2011. He even pointed at Biden. He said, what your problem is? You guys look at us and we look like you and we have the same skin color. And so you think we think like you, but we don't. We're not part of your liberal, democratic, European West. We're different. But if Ukrainians are just Russians with accents and they're practicing democracy, that undermines his argument at home. And that's why, to your point, he is truly obsessed with Ukraine and taking it back in. I think the big mistake was, there was something called the Russian Empire. Then it became the Soviet Empire. But then it ended peacefully, rather peacefully. And there wasn't enough separation between the colonies and the metropole. And there was this ambiguous relationship, partly because it's contiguous. And had the Soviet Union been truly defeated and anti-colonial people truly took over for the long haul. Remember, the Soviet Union collapsed because Russia declared independence from the Soviet Union. And there was that movement, but it was too weak. And so that's why we're back to this kind of recolonization, neo-imperial time that tragically is, we're watching the tragic consequences of it inside Ukraine.
If Ukraine is so important to Putin, we agree it is, and you as you make the point from the democratic perspective, culturally, historically, whatever. How does this end? Russia's already lost an estimated million men, dead and wounded, million servicemen and women. Suffered, extraordinary economic setbacks, both from the sanctions and what we're now seeing, this Ukrainian campaign against its energy infrastructure that's doing real damage. It's become a kind of vassal state of China, really, Russia. But, if the stakes are so high for Putin, how can we reasonably expect, again, there's been, I don't want to say stalemate, but the battle lines haven't fundamentally changed very much in the last 2 years. What can we really realistically expect? How can we realistically expect this war to end?
I don't know. And I don't know anybody that does know the answer to your question. I talk to Ukrainians every single day. I've already corresponded with a half a dozen this morning who are, want an answer to your question as well. I think knowing Putin and knowing a little bit about the history of wars, They tend to end, not always, but they tend to end in two ways. One side wins or there's a stalemate on the battlefield. And right now, tragically, neither of those conditions are present. It feels like a stalemate if you just look at it, day to day. But from Putin's perspective, they're making incremental progress on the battlefield. And he believes, and he might be right, by the way, that we'll eventually tire of supporting this war, we in the West. And then what is now incremental gains will become bigger territorial grabs. And I can tell you, my Ukrainian friends are worried about that too. They've fought heroically, the third largest army in the world. They stopped them. They really haven't taken much territory. If the war ends today, I think this will be remembered kind of like the Soviet invasion of Finland in the history books. But they're worried that because he's so stubborn and he doesn't care about his people and there's no resistance inside his country, and they still have enough resources because they have, oil and gas that people are willing to buy, he'll just keep fighting. And most certainly they worry he'll fight at least till he's conquered the territories that he annexed on paper, and he hasn't done that yet. But that's why the war will continue. And so for me, we got to stop focusing on Putin's intentions and just focus on reducing his capabilities. And that's more and better weapons to the Ukrainians and more and better sanctions against the Russians. And I know that's a horrible, imperfect answer, but I don't think we're going to change his mind. So we have to change his ability to keep fighting.
Let's talk about one of the other things you write about in the book, of course, and you mentioned it at the beginning, which is not just the different circumstances that the new Cold War, if we can call it that, China in particular, China and its allies represent compared with the 20th century, but the changed circumstances here in the United States and much of the West too. It's fair that we don't have to go into how much, what one may think about what's happening to our democratic systems here, our political system here, or in Europe. We can have an argument about that. But there are a lot of people who think that we're kind of, we're in a sort of post-liberal, the liberal order that the United States obviously was very much involved in, responsible largely for creating in the during the Cold War and then in the post-Cold War period. That is itself kind of fragmenting, right? You're seeing it here in the US. You're seeing it to a large extent with our key allies still in NATO in Europe. I mean, does it even make sense anymore to think of this, again, to go to the title of your book, to think of this as a struggle between autocrats and democrats? And again, I'm not suggesting for a minute that Donald Trump is a Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, but that the whole idea of a world divided between kind of purist liberal democracy and authoritarian autocracy on the other hand, that maybe that sort of cleavage is somehow kind of dissolving anyway.
That most certainly is analytically true. There's been the rise of these autocracies and the erosion of democratic procedures in the United States and around the world. If you look at Freedom House scores, we're in a 20-year recession with respect to democratic practices. That is true. But my solution to that, my prescription to that, is not to say, let's stop worrying about democratic ideas and the liberal internationalist order is over. Let's go back to some Hobbesian, pre-World War II world. My response is, let's not blow it all up. Let's actually try to fix it and reform it. And because when I add up the military power of the democracies, we still have way more military power than China and Russia together. When I add up economic power, as I do in the book, between democracies versus autocrats, we still have way more economic power. And when I look at the public polling around the world, most people around the world still agree with Churchill. Horrible system of government, but it's better than all the others tried. Those are advantages I see for my country. And the alternative, there's this fatalism in my country right now and in my circles, like it's all over. We're in decline. We have no confidence in our ideas. We got to be more like China, right? We all got to, adopt the Chinese way of thinking these days. That's where that's the future. That could be right. Let's find out in 20 or 30 years. But I still think the alternatives that I've seen are worse than what we've had before with a reformed agenda. We're not going back to 1991. That's That's folly. I get it. But I think the cleavage between autocrats and Democrats is real. And I believe this just not analytically. This is a normative thing. I actually prefer democracy over autocracy. I'm not a big fan of autocrats. I've had lots of friends killed by autocrats. And they tried to arrest me, by the way. So I think there's a normative piece to it as well. And I'll two things I'll say, that I don't know the answer to, but that animates me. Number one, I've studied the 1930s. And back in the 1930s, they said the same thing about, people like me. Oh, your ideas are passé, you liberal Democrats. It's either fascism or communism. Those are the ascendant ideas. Your ideas are passé. Happened again in the 60s and 70s. The Marxist-Leninists were taking over all over the world. It was just the cancer that was communism that was spreading. We were in disarray here in America. I think people forget how bad things got here in terms of polarization in the United States. And people said the same thing. These liberal democratic ideas, people that espouse them were, considered dinosaurs. 15 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. So that, and by the way, then hundreds of years of history, the trajectory towards greater freedom, greater democratic systems of government versus autocracies, it's just overwhelming what the trajectory of that, if you go back hundreds of years. So those things give me hope in terms of data. But I'll tell you the last thing that gives me hope. There's a cynicism on the East Coast and the West Coast about everything. But I've just given a dozen talks in South Carolina, Erie, Pennsylvania, Hudson, Ohio, going to Texas. I've been to Texas twice. I'm going to Texas again on Friday. And every time I talk about values here in the United States, that's when people applaud. I think actually Americans care about, they want to be on the side of good and not evil. They don't want to embrace Putin. I understand President Trump doesn't divide the world between autocrats and Democrats. He divides it between strong leaders and weak leaders, but he loses the American people when he talks that way. We don't have many polls that show 80% of Americans on one side, but 80% of Americans don't like Putin. That gives me optimism that when I talk in these other places, that people actually do think in these terms, autocrats versus Democrats. And so maybe I'm going to lose this argument. I got it, but I wrote the book to try to make the argument. It's going to be a long haul to keep. This is going to be a debate that will measure in years and decades, not one electoral cycle. But I'm in the fight for sure.
Oh, that's a very good note to end, Michael. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. Michael, the book is Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. Michael McFaul, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thank you. Fantastic conversation.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Free Expression. Thanks again for joining us. We'll be back next week with another episode. No doubt there'll be plenty more to think about and talk about in the course of the next week. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And we'll speak to you again next week. In the meantime, have a great week and goodbye.